Hello, and welcome to part two of Paul Mark Reed's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm still in conservatory. I haven't got my studio sorted out yet. It's in a right mess. I've still got a lot of work to do on it. Sound booth is up and running, but I can't get in there at the moment because I've just changed internet providers because the last one was rubbish. I was only getting 2 Mbps per second. I mean, that's all I was getting. 2 Mbps. It's just ridiculous. Now it's a lot better, it's a lot more stable, and hopefully we won't have a dropout like we did last week. Anyway, let's crack on. I hope that you're all well and you're ready for this. I've got my weak lemon drink and my towel handy. I hope you've got yours handy. Maybe a nice cup of tea, not one made by a Nutrimatic drinks dispenser. So anyway, let's the story so far. Arthur Dent has been saved from the destruction of the planet Earth by his friend Ford Prefect, who turns out not to be from Guildford as he always claimed, but to be from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse. They've managed to hitch a ride on a Vogon constructor fleet. Unfortunately, they were captured by the Vogons, and the captain read them some of his poetry before bunging them into an airlock and blasting them out into space, and that's where we pick up. I'm just going to block the camera off again because you don't want to be looking at my ugly mug while I'm reading. So anyway, there we go. Part 2. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a wholly remarkable book. It has been compiled and recompiled many times over many years and under many different editorships. It contains contributions from countless numbers of travellers and researchers, and the introduction begins like this. Space, it says, is big, really big. You just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to space. Listen, and so on. After a while, the style settles down a bit, and it begins to tell you things you really need to know, like the fact that the fabulously beautiful planet Beth Celemin is now so worried about the cumulative erosion by 10 billion visiting tourists a year that any net imbalance between the amount you eat and the amount you excrete whilst on the planet is surgically removed from your body weight when you leave. So every time you go to the lavatory, it's vitally important to get a receipt. To be fair, though, when confronted by the sheer enormity of distances between the stars, better minds than the one responsible for the guide's introduction have faltered. Some invite you to consider for a moment a peanut in reading, and a small walnut in Johannesburg, and other dizzying concepts. The simple truth is that interstellar distances will not fit into the human imagination. Even light, which travels so fast that it takes most racers thousands of years to realize that it travels at all, takes time to journey between the stars. It takes 8 minutes from the star Sol to the place where the Earth used to be, and 4 years more to arrive at Sol's nearest stellar neighbour, Alpha Proxima. For light to reach the other side of the galaxy, for it to reach Damagran, for instance, takes rather longer, 500,000 years. The record for hitchhiking this distance is just under 5 years, but you don't get to see much on the way. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy says that if you hold a lungful of air, you can survive in the total vacuum of space for about 30 seconds. However, it goes on to say that what with space being the mind-boggling size it is, the chances of getting picked up by another ship within those 30 seconds are 2 to the power of 267,709 to 1 against. And by a totally staggering coincidence, that's also the telephone number of an Islington flat where Arthur once went to a very good party and met a very nice girl whom he totally failed to get off with. She went off with a gatecrasher. Though the planet Earth, the Islington flat and the telephone have all now been demolished, it's comforting to reflect that they are all in some way commemorated by the fact that 29 seconds later, Ford and Arthur were rescued. A computer chattered to itself in alarm as it noticed an airlock open and close itself for no apparent reason. This was because reason was in fact out to lunch. A hole had just appeared in the galaxy. It was exactly a nothing of a second long, a nothing of of an inch wide, and quite a lot of million light years from end to end. As it closed up, lots of paper hats and party balloons fell out of it and drifted off through the universe. A team of 73-foot high market analysts fell out of it and died, partly of asphyxiation and partly of surprise. 239,000 lightly fried eggs fell out of it too, materializing in a large wobbly heap on the famine-struck land of Pogrel in the Pansel system. The whole Pogrel tribe had died out from famine except for one last man, who died of cholesterol poisoning some weeks later. The nothing of a second for which the whole existed reverberated backwards and forwards through time in a most improbable fashion. Somewhere in the deeply remote past it seriously traumatized a small random group of atoms drifting through the empty sterility of space and made them cling together in the most extraordinary and unlikely patterns. These patterns quickly learned to copy themselves. This was part of what was so extraordinary of the patterns, and went on to cause massive trouble on every planet they drifted onto. That was how life began in the universe. 5 wild event maelstroms swirled in vicious storms of unreason and spewed up a pavement. On the pavement lay Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent gulping like half-spent fish. "There you are," gasped Ford, scrabbling for a finger-hole in the pavement as it raced through the third reach of the unknown. "I told you I'd think of something." "Oh, sure," said Arthur. "Sure." "Bright idea of mine," said Ford. "Find a passing spaceship and get rescued by it." The real universe arched sickeningly away beneath them. Various pretend ones flitted silently by like mountain goats. Primal light exploded, spattering space-time as with gobbets of junket. Time blossomed, matter shrank away, the highest prime number coalesced quietly in a corner and hid itself away forever. "Oh, come off it," said Arthur. "The chances against it were astronomical." "Don't knock it, it worked," said Ford. "What sort of ship are we in?" asked Arthur, as the pit of eternity yawned beneath them. "I don't know yet," said Ford. "I haven't opened my eyes yet." "No, nor have I," said Arthur. The universe jumped, froze, quivered, and splayed out in several unexpected directions. Arthur and Ford opened their eyes and looked about in considerable surprise. "Good God," said Arthur. "It looks just like the seafront at Southend." "Hell, I'm relieved to hear you say that," said Ford. "Why?" "Because I thought I might be going mad." "Oh, perhaps you are. Perhaps you only thought I said it." Ford thought about this. "Well, did you say it or didn't you?" he asked. "I think so," said Arthur. "Well, perhaps we're both going mad." "Yes," said Arthur. "We'd be mad, all things considered, to think that this was Southend." "Well, do you think this is Southend?" "Oh, yes." "So do I." "Well, therefore we must be mad." "Nice day for it." "Yes," said a passing maniac. "Who is that?" "Who? The man with the 5 heads and the elderberry bush full of kippers?" "Yes." "I don't know. Just someone." "Ah." They both sat on the pavement and watched with a certain unease as huge children bounced heavily along the sand and wild horses thundered through the sky, taking fresh supplies of reinforced railings to the uncertain areas. "You know," said Arthur with a slight cough, "if this is Southend, there's something very odd about it." "You mean the way the sea stays steady and the buildings keep washing up and down?" said Ford. "Yes, I thought that was odd too." "In fact," he continued, as with a huge bang Southend split itself into 6 equal segments, which danced and span giddily round each other in lewd and licentious formation, "there's something altogether very strange going on." Wild yowling noises of pipes and strings seared out through the wind. Hot doughnuts popped out of the road for 10 pence each. Horrid fish stormed out of the sky, and Arthur and Ford decided to make a run for it. They plunged through heavy walls of sound, mountains of archaic thought, valleys of mood music, bad shoe sessions, and footling bats, and suddenly heard a girl's voice. It sounded quite sensible voice, but it just said, "2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against and falling." And that was all. Ford skidded down a beam of light and span round trying to find a source for the voice, but could see nothing he could seriously believe in. "What was that voice?" shouted Arthur. "I don't know," yelled Ford. "I don't know. It sounded like a measurement of probability." "Probability? What do you mean?" "Probability. You know, like 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 4 against. It said 2 to the power of 100,000 to 1 against. That's pretty improbable, you know. A million-gallon vat of custard upended itself over them without warning. "But what does it mean?" cried Arthur. "What? The custard?" "No! The measurement of probability." "I don't know. I don't know at all. I think we're on some kind of spaceship." "I can only assume," said Arthur, "that this is not the first-class compartment." Bulges appeared in the fabric of space-time. Great, ugly bulges. "Ah!" said Arthur, as he felt his body softening and bending in unusual directions. "Southend seems to be melting away. The stars are swirling. A dust bowl. My legs are drifting off into the sunset. My left arm's come off too." A frightening thought struck him. "Hell," he said, "how am I going to operate my digital watch now?" He wound his eyes desperately around in Ford's direction. "Ford," he said, "you're turning into a penguin. Stop it." Again came the voice. 2 to the power of 75,000 to 1 against and falling. Ford waddled around his pond in a furious circle. "Hey, who are you?" he quacked. "Where are you? What's going on? Is there any way of stopping it?" "Please relax," said the voice pleasantly, like a stewardess in an airliner with only one wing and two engines, one of which is on fire. "You're perfectly safe." "But that's not the point," raged Ford. "The point is I am now a perfectly safe penguin, and my colleague here is rapidly running out of limbs." "It's all right, I've got them back now," said Arthur. 2 to the power of 50,000 to 1 against and falling," said the voice. "Admittedly," said Arthur, "they're longer than I usually like them, but—" "Isn't there anything," squawked Ford in avian fury, "you feel you ought to be telling us?" The voice cleared its throat. A giant petit four lolloped off into the distance. "Welcome," the voice said, "to the starship Heart of Gold." The voice continued. "Please do not be alarmed," it said, "by anything you see or hear around you. You're bound to feel some initial ill effects as you've been rescued from certain death at an improbability level of 2 to the power of 276,000 to 1 against, possibly much higher. We are now cruising at a level of 2 to the power of 25,000 to 1 against and falling, and we'll be restoring normality just as soon as we're sure what is normal anyway. Thank you. 2 to the power of 20,000 to 1 against and falling." The voice cut out. Ford and Arthur were in a small, luminous pink cubicle. Ford was wildly excited. "Arthur," he said, "this is fantastic. We've been picked up by a ship powered by the infinite improbability drive. This is incredible. I heard rumours about it before. They were all officially denied, but they must have done it. They've built the improbability drive. Arthur, what's happening?" Arthur had jammed himself against the door to the cubicle, trying to hold it closed, but it was ill-fitting. Tiny, furry little hands were squeezing themselves through the cracks. Their fingers were ink-stained. Their tiny voices chattered insanely. Arthur looked up. "Ford," he said, "there's an infinite number of monkeys outside who want to talk to us about the script for Hamlet they've worked out." The infinite improbability drive is a wonderful new method of crossing vast interstellar distances in a mere nothing of a second without all that tedious mucking about in hyperspace. It was discovered by a lucky chance and then developed into a governable form of propulsion by the Galactic Government's research team on Damagran. This, briefly, is the story of its discovery. The principle of generating small amounts of finite improbability by simply hooking the logic circuits of a Bambleweenie 57 sub-meson brain to an atomic vector plotter suspended in a strong Brownian motion producer, say a nice hot cup of tea, were of course well understood, and such generators were often used to break the ice at parties by making all the molecules in the hostess's undergarments leap simultaneously one foot to the left in accordance with a theory of indeterminacy. Many respectable physicists said that they weren't going to stand for this, partly because it was a debasement of science, but mostly because they didn't get invited to those sort of parties. Another thing they couldn't stand was the perpetual failure they encountered in trying to construct a machine which could generate the infinite improbability field needed to flip a spaceship across the mind-paralyzing distances between the furthest stars, and in the end they grumpily announced that such a machine was virtually impossible. Then one day a student who'd been left to sweep up the lab after a particularly unsuccessful party found himself reasoning this way. If, he thought to himself, such a machine is a virtual impossibility, then it must logically be a finite improbability. So all I have to do in order to make one is to work out exactly how improbable it is, feed that figure into the finite improbability generator, give it a fresh cup of really hot tea, and turn it on. He did this and was rather startled to discover that he had managed to create the long sought after golden infinite improbability generator out of thin air. It startled him even more when, just after he was awarded the Galactic Institute's Prize for Extreme Cleverness, he got lynched by a rampaging mob of respectable physicists who'd finally realised that the one thing they really couldn't stand was a smart-ass. The improbability-proof control cabin of the Heart of Gold looked like a perfectly conventional spaceship, except that it was perfectly clean because it was so new. Some of the control seats hadn't had the plastic wrapping taken off yet. The cabin was mostly white, oblong, and about the size of a smallish restaurant. In fact, it wasn't perfectly oblong. The two long walls were raked around in slight parallel curve, and all the angles and corners were contoured in excitingly chunky shapes. The truth of the matter is that it would have been a great deal simpler and more practical to build the cabin as an ordinary three-dimensional oblong room, but then the designers would have got miserable. As it was, the cabin looked excitingly purposeful, with large video screens ranged over the control and guidance system panels on the concave wall, and long banks of computers set into the convex wall. In one corner, a robot sat humped, its gleaming brushed steel head hanging loosely between its gleaming brushed steel knees. It too was fairly new, but though it was beautifully constructed and polished, it somehow looked as if the various parts of its more or less humanoid body didn't quite fit properly. In fact, they fitted perfectly well, but something in its bearing suggested that they might have fitted better. Zaphod Beeblebrox paced nervously up and down the cabin, brushing his hands over pieces of gleaming equipment and giggling with excitement. Trillian sat hunched over a clump of instruments reading off figures. Her voice was carried round the tannoy system of the whole ship. 5 to 1 against and falling, she said. 4 to 1 against and falling. 3 to 1, 2, 1. Probability factor of 1 to 1. We have normality. I repeat, we have normality. She turned her microphone off, then turned it back on, with a slight smile, and continued, Anything you still can't cope with is therefore your own problem. Please relax, you'll be sent for soon. Zaphod burst out in annoyance. Who are they, Trillian? Trillian spun a seat round to face him and shrugged. Oh, just a couple of guys who seem to have picked up in open space, she said. Section ZZ9 Plural Z Alpha. Yeah, well, that's a very sweet talk, Trillian, complained Zaphod. But do you really think it's wise under the circumstances? I mean, here we are on the run and everything. We must have the police of half the galaxy after us by now, and we stopped to pick up hitchhikers. Okay, so 10 out of 10 for style, but minus several million for good thinking, yeah? He tapped irritably at the control panel. Trillian quietly moved his hand before he tapped anything important. Whatever Zaphod's qualities of mind might include, dash, bravado, conceit, he was mechanically inept and could easily blow up the ship with an extravagant gesture. Trillian had come to suspect that the main reason why he had such a wild and successful life that he never really understood the significance of anything he did. Zaphod, she said patiently, they were floating unprotected in open space. You wouldn't want them to have died, would you? Oh, well, no, not as such, but not as such, not die as such, but Trillian cocked her head on one side. Oh, well, maybe someone else might have picked them up later. A second later, and they would have been dead. Yeah, so if you'd taken the trouble to think about the problem a bit longer, it would have gone away. You'd been happy to let them die. Well, not happy as such, but anyway, said Trillian, turning back to the controls, I didn't pick them up. Well, what do you mean? Who picked them up then? The ship did. Huh? The ship did, all by itself. Huh? Whilst we were in improbability drive. But that's incredible. No, Zaphod, just very, very improbable. Yeah. Look, Zaphod, she said, patting his arm. Don't worry about the aliens. They're just a couple of guys, I expect. I'll send the robot down to get them and bring them up here. Hey, Marvin! In the corner, the robot's head swung up sharply, but then wobbled about imperceptibly. It pulled itself up to its feet as if it was about 5 pounds heavier than it actually was, and made what an outside observer would have thought was a heroic effort to cross the room. It stopped in front of Trillian and seemed to stare through her left shoulder. "I think you ought to know I'm feeling very, very depressed," it said. Its voice was low and hopeless. "Oh, God," muttered Zaphod, and slumped into a seat. "Well," said Trillian, in a bright, compassionate tone, "here's something to occupy you and keep your mind off things." "It won't work," groaned Marvin. "I have an exceptionally large mind." "Marvin," warned Trillian. "All right," said Marvin. "What do you want me to do?" "Go down to number 2 entry bay and bring the 2 aliens up here under surveillance." With a microsecond pause and a finely calculated micromodulation of pitch and timbre, nothing you could actually take offence at, Marvin managed to convey his utter contempt and horror of all things human. "Just that?" he said. "Yes," said Trillian firmly. "I won't enjoy it," said Marvin. Zaphod leaped out of his seat. "She's not asking you to enjoy it," he shouted. "Just do it, will you?" "All right," said Marvin, like the tolling of a great cracked bell. "I'll do it." "Good," snapped Zaphod. "Great, thank you." Marvin turned and lifted his flat-topped triangular red eyes up towards him. "I'm not getting you down at all, am I?" he said pathetically. "No, no, Marvin," little Trillian. "That's just fine, really." "I wouldn't like to think that I was getting you down." "No, don't worry about that," the lilt continued. "You just act as comes naturally, and everything will be just fine." "You're sure you don't mind?" probed Marvin. "No, no, Marvin," lilted Trillian. "That's just fine, really. Just part of life." Marvin flashed an electronic look. "Life," said Marvin. "Don't talk to me about life." He turned hopelessly on his heel and lugged himself out of a cabin. With a satisfied hum and a click, the door closed behind him. "I don't think I can stand that robot much longer, Zaphod," growled Trillian. The Encyclopedia Galactica defines robot as a mechanical apparatus designed to do the work of a man. The marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation defines a robot as your plastic pal who's fun to be with. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy defines the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who'll be the first against the wall when the revolution comes, with a footnote to the effect that the editors would welcome applications from anyone interested in taking over the post of robotics correspondent. Curiously enough, an edition of the Encyclopedia Galactica that had the good fortune to fall through a time warp from 1,000 years in the future defined the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation as a bunch of mindless jerks who were the first against the wall when the revolution came. The pink cubicle had winked out of existence. The monkeys had sunk away to a better dimension. Ford and Arthur found themselves in the embarkation area of the ship. It was rather smart. "I think this ship's brand new," said Ford. "How can you tell?" asked Arthur. "Have you got some exotic device for measuring the age of metal?" "No, I just found this sales brochure lying on the floor. It's a lot of the universe can be yours stuff." "Ah, look, I was right." Ford jabbed at one of the pages and showed it to Arthur. "It says sensational new breakthrough in improbability physics. As soon as the ship's drive reaches infinite improbability, it passes through every point in the universe, be the envy of other major governments. Wow, this is really big league stuff." Ford hunted excitedly through the technical specs of the ship, occasionally gasping with astonishment at what he read. Clearly, galactic astrotechnology had moved ahead during the years of his exile. Arthur listened for a short while, but being unable to understand the vast majority of what Ford was saying, he began to let his mind wander, trailing his fingers along the edge of an incomprehensible computer bank. He reached out and pressed an invitingly large red button on a nearby panel. The panel lit up with the words, "Please do not press this button again." He shook himself. "Listen," said Ford, who was still engrossed in the sales brochure. "They make a big thing of the ship's cybernetics. A new generation of Sirius Cybernetics Corporation robots and computers with the new GPP feature." "GPP feature?" said Arthur. "What's that?" "Oh, it says genuine people personalities." "Oh," said Arthur. "Sounds ghastly." A voice behind them said, "It is." The voice was low and hopeless and accompanied by a slight clanking sound. They spun round and saw an abject steel man standing hunched in the doorway. "What?" they said. "Ghastly," continued Marvin. "It all is. Absolutely ghastly. Just don't even talk about it. Look at this door," he said, stepping through it. The irony circuits cut into his voice modulator as he mimicked the style of the sales brochure. "All the doors in this spaceship have a cheerful and sunny disposition. It is their pleasure to open for you, and their satisfaction to close again with the knowledge of a job well done." As the door closed behind them, it became apparent that it did indeed have a satisfied sigh-like quality to it. "Hmm," it said. Marvin regarded it with cold loathing, while his logic circus chattered with disgust and tinkered with the concept of directing physical violence against it. Further circuits cut in and saying, "Why bother? What's the point? Nothing's worth getting involved in." Further circuits amused themselves by analysing the molecular components of this door and one of the humanoid brain cells. For a quick encore, they measured the level of hydrogen emissions in the surrounding cubic parsec of space and then shut down again in boredom. A spasm of despair shook the robot's body as he turned. "Come on," he droned. "I've been ordered to take you down to the bridge. Here I am, brain the size of a planet, and they asked me to take you down to the bridge. Call that job satisfaction? 'Cause I don't." He turned and walked back to the hated door. Excuse me," said Ford, following after him. "Which government owns this ship?" Marvin ignored him. "You watch this door," he muttered. "It's about to open again. I can tell by the intolerable air of smugness it generates." With an ingratiating little whine, the door slid open again and Marvin stomped through. "Come on," he said. The others followed quietly and quickly, and the door slid back into place with pleased little clicks and whirs. "Thank you, the marketing division of the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation," said Marvin, and trudged desolately up the gleaming curved corridor that stretched out before them. "Let's build robots with genuine people personalities," they said. "So they tried it out with me. I'm a personality prototype. You can tell, can't you?" Ford and Arthur muttered embarrassed little disclaimers. "I hate that door," continued Marvin. "I'm not getting you down at all, am I?" "Which government?" started Ford again. "No government owns it," snapped the robot. "It's been stolen." "Stolen?" "Stolen," mimicked Marvin. "Who by?" asked Ford. "Zaphod Beeblebrox." Something extraordinary happened to Ford's face. At least 5 entirely separate and distinct expressions of shock and amazement piled upon it in a jumbled mess. His left leg, which was in mid-stride, seemed to have difficulty in finding the floor again. He stared at the robot and tried to entangle some dartoid muscles. Oh, dartoid muscle, never heard of them. Is that deltoid now? "Zaphod Beeblebrox," he said weakly. "Sorry, did I say something wrong?" said Marvin, dragging himself on regardless. "Pardon me for breathing, which I never do anyway, so I don't know why I bothered to say it. Oh, God, I'm so depressed. Here's another of those self-satisfied doors. Life. Don't talk to me about life." "No one ever mentioned it," muttered Arthur, irritably. "Ford, you all right?" Ford stared at him. "Did that robot say Zaphod Beeblebrox?" he said. A loud clatter of gunk music flooded through the Heart of Gold cabin as Zaphod searched the sub-ether radio waveband for news of himself. The machine was rather difficult to operate. For years, radios had been operated by means of pressing buttons and turning dials. Then, as technology became more sophisticated, the tech controls were made touch-sensitive. You merely had to brush the panels with your fingers. Now all you had to do was wave your hand in the general direction of the components and hope. It saved a lot of muscular expenditure, of course, but meant that you had to sit infuriatingly still if you wanted to keep listening to the same program. Zaphod waved a hand and the channel switched again. More gunk music, but this time it was a background to a news announcement. The news was always heavily edited to fit the rhythms of music. "And news brought to you here on the sub-ether waveband, broadcasting around the galaxy around the clock," squawked a voice. "And we'll be saying a big hello to all intelligent life forms everywhere. And to everyone else out there, the secret's to bang the rocks together, guys." And of course, the big news story tonight is the sensational theft of the new Improbability Drive prototype ship by none other than Galactic President Zaphod Beeblebrox. And the question everyone asking is, has the big Z finally flipped? Beeblebrox, the man who invented the Pangalactic Goggle Blaster, ex-confidence trickster, once described by eccentric Columbus as the best bang since the big one, and recently voted the worst-dressed sentient being in the known universe for the 7th time. Has he got an answer this time? We asked his private brain care specialist, Gag Hellfront. The music swirled and died for a moment. Another voice broke in, presumably Hellfront. He said, "Well, Zaphod's just this guy, you know?" But got no further because an electric pencil flew across the cabin and through the radio's on-off sensitive airspace. Zaphod turned and glared at Trillian. She'd thrown the pencil. "Hey," he said, "what do you do that for?" Trillian was tapping her fingers on a screen full of figures. "I've just thought of something," she said. "Yeah? Worth interrupting a news bulletin about me for?" "You hear enough about yourself as it is. I'm very insecure. We know that. Can we drop your ego for a moment? This is important." "Hey, if there's anything more important than my ego around here, I want it caught and shot now." Zaphod glared at her again, then laughed. "Listen," she said, "we picked up those couple of guys." "What couple of guys?" "The couple of guys we picked up." "Oh, yeah," said Zaphod. "Those couple of guys. We picked them up in Sector ZZ9 Plural Z Alpha." "Yeah?" said Zaphod and blinked. Trillian said quietly, "Does that mean anything to you?" Said Zaphod. ZZ9 Plural Z Alpha. ZZ9 Plural Z Alpha? "Well," said Trillian. What does the Z mean?" said Zaphod. "Which one?" "Anyone." One of the major difficulties Trillian experienced in a relationship with Zaphod was learning to distinguish between him pretending to be stupid or just to get people off their guard, pretending to be stupid because he couldn't be bothered to think and wanted someone else to do it for him, and pretending to be outrageously stupid to hide the fact that he actually didn't understand what was going on, and really being genuinely stupid. He was renowned for being an amazingly clever and He was renowned for being amazingly clever, and quite clearly was so, but not all the time, which obviously worried him, hence the act. Excuse me. He proffered people to be puzzled rather than contemptuous. This, above all, appealed to Trillian to be genuinely stupid, but she could no longer be bothered to argue about it. She sighed and punched up a star map on the Visi screen so she could make it simple for him, whatever his reasons for wanting it to be that way. "There," she pointed. "Right there." "Hey, yeah," said Zaphod. "Well," she said. "Well, what?" Parts of the inside of her head screamed at other parts of the inside of her head, and she said very calmly, "It's the same sector you originally picked me up in." He looked at her and then looked back at the screen. "Hey, yeah," he said. "Now that is wild. We should have zapped straight through it into the middle of the Horsehead Nebula. How do we come to be there? I mean, that's nowhere." She ignored this. "Improbability drive," she said patiently. "You explained it to me yourself. We passed through every point in the universe. You know that." "Yeah, but that's one wild coincidence, isn't it?" "Yes." "Picking someone up at that point, out of the whole of the universe to choose from, that's just too... I want to work this out. Hey, computer!" The Sirius Cybernetics Corporation shipboard computer, which controlled and permeated every particle of the ship, switched into communication mode. "Hi there!" it spread brightly, and simultaneously spewed out a tiny ribbon of ticker tape just for the record. The ticker tape said, "Hi there." "Oh, God," said Zaphod. He hadn't worked with his computer long, but had already learned to loathe it. The computer continued, brash and cheery as if it was selling detergent. "I want you to know that whatever your problem, I'm here to help you solve it." Yeah, said Zaphod. "Look, I think I'll just use a piece of paper." "Sure thing," said the computer, spilling out his message into a waste bin at the same time. "I understand. If you ever want..." "Shut up," said Zaphod, and snatching up a pencil, sat down next to Trillian at the console. Okay, said the computer in a hurt tone of voice, and closed down its speech channel again. Zaphod and Trillian pored over the figures that the improbability flight path scanner flashed silently up in front of them. "Can we work out," said Zaphod, "from their point of view, what the improbability of their rescue was?" "Yes, that's a constant," said Trillian. 2 to the power of 276,709 to 1 against. "Well, that's high. They're two lucky guys." "Yes, but relative to what we were doing when the ship picked them up." Trillian punched up the figures. They showed 2 to the power of infinity minus 1, an irrational number that only has a conventional meaning in probability physics. "Well, that's pretty low," continued Zaphod with a slight whistle. "Yes," agreed Trillian, and looked at him quizzically. "That's one big whack of improbability to account for. Something improbable has got to show up on the balance sheet if it's all going to add up into a pretty sum." Zaphod scribbled a few sums, crossed them out, and threw the pencil away. "Bats, doo-doo. I can't work it out." "Well?" Zaphod knocked his two heads together in irritation and gritted his teeth. "Okay," he said. "Computer." The voice circuit sprang to life again. "Why, hello there," they said. Ticker-tape, ticker-tape. "All I want to do is make your day nicer and nicer and nicer." "Yeah, well, shut up and work something out for me." "Sure thing," chattered the computer. "You want a probability forecast based on improbability data, yeah." "Okay," the computer continued. "Here's an interesting little notion. Did you realize that most people's lives are governed by telephone numbers?" A pained look crawls across one of Zaphod's faces and onto the other one. "Have you flipped?" he said. "No, but you will when I tell you that—" Trillian gasped. She scribbled at the buttons on the improbability flight path screen. "Telephone number?" she said. "Did that thing say telephone number?" Numbers flashed up on the screen. The computer had paused politely, but now it continued. "What I was about to say was—" "Don't bother, please," said Trillian. "Look, what is this?" said Zaphod. "I don't know," said Trillian, "but those aliens are on the way up to the bridge with that wretched robot. Can we pick them up on any monitor cameras?" Marvin trudged on down the corridor, still moaning. "And then, of course, I've got this terrible pain in all the diodes down my left-hand side." "No," said Arthur grimly as he walked along beside him. "Really?" "Oh, yes," said Marvin. "I mean, I've asked for them to be replaced, but no one ever listens." "I can imagine." Vague whistling and humming noises were coming from Ford. Well, he kept saying to himself. Zaphod Beeblebrox. Suddenly Marvin stopped and held up a hand. "You know what's happened now, of course." "No. What?" said Arthur, who didn't want to know. "We've arrived at another of those wretched doors." There was a sliding door set into the side of the corridor. Marvin eyed it suspiciously. "Well," said Ford impatiently, "do we go through?" "Do we go through?" mimicked Marvin. "Yes, this is the entrance to the bridge. I was told to take you to the bridge. Probably the highest demand that will be made on my intellectual capabilities today, I shouldn't wonder." Slowly, with great loathing, he stepped towards the door like a hunter stalking his prey. Suddenly it slid open. "Thank you," it said, "for making a simple door very happy." Deep in Marvin's thorax, gears ground. "Funny," he intoned funerally. Just how when you think life can't possibly get any worse, it suddenly does." He heaved himself through the door and left Ford and Arthur staring at each other and shrugging their shoulders. From inside they heard Marvin's voice again. "I suppose you want to see the aliens now," he said. "Do you want me to sit in a corner and rust, or just fall apart where I'm standing?" "Yes, just show them in, would you, Marvin?" Arthur looked at Ford and was astonished to see him laughing. "What?" "Shh," said Ford. "Come in." They stepped through the bridge. Arthur followed him in nervously and was astonished to see a man lolling back in a chair with his feet on a control console, picking the teeth in his right-hand head with his left hand. The right-hand head seemed to be thoroughly preoccupied with his task, but the left-hand one was grinning a broad, relaxed, nonchalant grin. The number of things that Arthur couldn't believe he was seeing was fairly large. His jaw flopped about at the loose end for a while. The peculiar man waved a lazy wave at Ford and with an appalling affectation of nonchalance said, "Ford, hi. How are you? Glad you could drop in." Ford was not going to be outcooled. "Zaphod," he drawled. "Great to see you. You're looking well. The extra arms suit you. Nice ship you've stolen." Arthur goggled at him. "You mean you know this guy?" he said, waving a wild finger at Zaphod. "Know him?" exclaimed Ford. He's... He paused and decided to do the instructions the other way round. Oh, Zaphod, this is a friend of mine, Arthur Dent, he said. I saved him when his planet blew up. Oh, sure, said Zaphod. Hi, Arthur, glad you could make it. His right-hand head looked round casually and said, hi, and went back to having his teeth picked. Ford carried on. And Arthur, he said, this is my semi-cousin, Zaphod B. We've met, said Arthur sharply. And when you're cruising down the road in the fast lane, you lazily sail past a few hard-driving cars and are feeling pretty pleased with yourself, and then accidentally change down from fourth to first instead of third, thus making your engine leap out of your bonnet in a rather ugly mess, it tends to throw you off your stride in much the same way that this remark threw Ford Prefect off his. What? I said we've met. Zaphod gave an awkward start of surprise and jabbed a gum sharply. Hey, have we? Hey, Ford rounded on Arthur with an angry flash in his eyes. Now he felt he was back on home ground. He suddenly began to resent having lumbered himself with this ignorant primitive who knew as much about the affairs of the galaxies as an Ilford-based gnat knew about life in Peking. What do you mean you've met? He demanded. This is Zaphod Beeblebrox from Beetlejuice 5, you know, not bloody Martin Smith from Croydon. I don't care, said Arthur coldly. We've met, haven't we, Zaphod Beeblebrox, or should I say Phil? What? Shouted Ford. You're going to have to remind me, said Zaphod. I've a terrible memory for species. It was at a party, pursued Arthur. Yeah, well, I doubt that, said Zaphod. Cool it, will you, Arthur? Demanded Ford. Arthur would not be deterred. A party 6 months ago, on Earth, England. Zaphod shook his head with a tight-lipped smile. London, insisted Arthur. Islington. Oh, said Zaphod with a guilty start. That party. This wasn't fair on Ford at all. He looked backwards and forwards between Arthur and Zaphod. What? He said to Zaphod. You don't mean to say you've been on that miserable planet as well, do you? Well, no, of course not, said Zaphod breezily. Well, I may as well just dropped in briefly, you know, on my way somewhere. I was stuck there for 15 years. Well, I didn't know that, did I? But what were you doing there? Looking about, you know. He gate-crashed a party, persisted Arthur, trembling with anger. A fancy dress party. It would have to be, wouldn't it? Said Ford. At this party, persisted Arthur, was a girl. Oh, well, it doesn't matter now. The whole place has gone up in smoke anyway. I wish you'd stop sulking about that bloody planet, said Ford. Who was the lady? Oh, just somebody. Well, all right, I wasn't doing very well with her. I'd been trying all evening. Hell, she was something, though. Beautiful, charming, devastatingly intelligent. At last I got her to myself for a bit and was plying her with a bit of talk when this friend of yours barges up and says, Hey, doll, is this guy boring you? Why don't you come and talk to me instead? I'm from a different planet. I never saw her again. Zaphod? Exclaimed Ford. Yes, said Arthur, glaring at him and trying not to feel foolish. He only had the 2 arms and the 1 head, and he called himself Phil, but you must admit he did turn out to be from another planet, said Trillian, wandering into sight on the other edge of the bridge. She gave Arthur a pleasant smile which settled on him like a ton of bricks, and then turned her attention to the ship's controls again. There was silence for a few seconds, and then out of the scrambled mess of Arthur's brain crawled some words. Tricia Macmillan, he said. What are you doing here? Same as you, she said. I hitched a lift. After all, with a degree in maths and another in astrophysics, what else was there to do? It was either that or the dole queue again on Monday. Infinity -1, chattered the computer. Improbability sum now complete. Zaphod looked about him, at Ford, at Arthur, and then Trillian. Trillian, he said, is this sort of thing going to happen every time we use the improbability drive? Very probably, I'm afraid, she said. The Heart of Gold flew on silently through the night of space, now on a conventional photon drive. Its crew of 4 were ill at ease, knowing they had been brought together not of their own volition or by simple coincidence, but by some curious principle of physics, as if relationships between people were susceptible to the same laws that govern the relationships between atoms and molecules. As the ship's artificial night closed in, they were each grateful to retire to separate cabins and try to rationalize their thoughts. Trillian couldn't sleep. She sat on a couch and stared at a small cage which contained her last and only links with Earth, 2 white mice that she had insisted Zaphod let her bring. She'd expected not to see the planet again, but she was disturbed by a negative reaction to the planet's destruction. It seemed remote and unreal, and she could find no thoughts to think about it. She watched the mice scurrying around their cage and running furiously in their little plastic tread wheels till they occupied her whole attention. Suddenly she shook herself and went back to the bridge to watch over the tiny flashing lights and figures that charted the ship's progress through the void. She wished she knew what it was that she was trying not to think about. Zaphod couldn't sleep. He also wished he knew what it was that he wouldn't let him think himself about. For as long as he could remember, he'd suffered from a vague nagging feeling of being not all there. Most of the time he was able to put this thought aside and not worry about it, but it had been reawakened by the sudden inexplicable arrival of Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent. Somehow it seemed to conform to a pattern that he couldn't see. Ford couldn't sleep. He was too excited about being back on the road again. 15 years of virtual imprisonment were over. Just as he was finally beginning to give up hope, knocking about with Zaphod for a bit promised to be a lot of fun, though there seemed to be something faintly odd about his semi-cousin that he couldn't put his finger on. The fact that he'd become president of the galaxy was frankly astonishing, as was the manner of his leaving the post. Was there a reason behind it? There would be no point in asking Zaphod. He never appeared to have a reason for anything he did at all. He had turned unfathomably into an art form. He attacked everything in life with a mixture of extraordinary genius and naive incompetence, and it was often difficult to tell which was which. Arthur slept. He was terribly tired. There was a tap at Zaphod's door. It slid open. Zaphod? Yeah. I think we just found what you came to look for. Hey, yeah. Ford gave up the attempt to sleep. In the corner of his cabin was a small computer screen and keyboard. He sat at it for a while and tried to compose a new entry for the guide on the subject of Vogons, but couldn't think of anything vitriolic enough, so he gave that up too. Wrapped a robe around himself and went for a walk to the bridge. As he entered, he was surprised to see two figures hunched excitedly over the instruments. See? The ship's about to move into orbit, Trillium was saying. There's a planet out there. It's at the exact coordinates you predicted. Zaphod heard a noise and looked up. Ford, he hissed. Hey, come and take a look at this. Ford went and had a look at it. It was a series of figures flashing over a screen. You recognize those galactic coordinates? Said Zaphod. No. I'll give you a clue. Computer. Hi, gang, enthused the computer. This is getting real sociable, isn't it? Shut up, said Zaphod, and show up the screens. Light on the bridge sank. Pinpoints of light played across the consoles and reflected in 4 pairs of eyes that stared up at the external monitor screens. There was absolutely nothing on them. Recognize that? Whispered Zaphod. Ford frowned. No, he said. What do you see? Nothing. Recognize it? What are you talking about? We're in the Horsehead Nebula, one whole vast dark cloud. And I was meant to recognize that from a blank screen. Well, inside a dark nebula is the only place in the galaxy you'd see a dark screen. Very good. Zaphod laughed. He was clearly very excited about something, almost childishly so. Hey, this is really terrific. This is far too much. What's so great about being stuck in a dust cloud? Said Ford. What would you reckon to find here? Urged Zaphod. Nothing. No stars, no planets, no. Computer, shouted Zaphod. Rotate angle of vision through 180 degrees and don't talk about it. For a moment, it seemed that nothing was happening. Then a brightness glowed at the edge of the huge screen. A red star the size of a small plate crept across it. It followed quickly by... followed quickly by another one, a binary system. Then a vast crescent sliced into the corner of the picture, a red glare shading away into the deep black, the night side of the planet. I found it, cried Zaphod, thumping the console. I found it! Ford stared at it in astonishment. What is it? He said. That, said Zaphod, is the most improbable planet that ever existed. Excerpt from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, page 634,784, section 5A, entry Magrathea. Far back in the mists of ancient time, In the great and glorious days of the former Galactic Empire, life was wild, rich, and largely tax-free. Mighty starships plied their way between exotic suns, seeking adventure and reward amongst the furthest reaches of the galactic space. In those days, spirits were brave, the stakes were high, men were real men, women were real women, and small fairy creatures from Alpha Centauri were real small fairy creatures from Alpha Centauri. And all dared to brave unknown terrors, to do mighty deeds, to boldly split infinitives that no man had split before. And thus was the Empire forged. Many men, of course, became extremely rich, but this was perfectly natural and nothing to be ashamed of, because no one was really poor, at least no one worth speaking of. And for all the richest and most successful merchants, life inevitably became rather dull and niggly, and they began to imagine that this was therefore the fault of the worlds they settled on. None of them was entirely satisfactory. Either the climate wasn't right in the later part of the afternoon, or the day was half an hour too long, or the sea was exactly the wrong shade of pink. And thus were created the conditions for a staggering new form of specialist industry: custom-made luxury planet building. The home of this industry was the planet Magrathea, where hyperspatial engineers sucked matter through white holes in space to form it into dream planets, gold planets, platinum planets, soft rubber planets with lots of earthquakes, all lovingly made to meet the exacting standards that the galaxy's richest men naturally came to expect. But so successful was this venture that Magrathea itself soon became the richest planet of all time, and the rest of the galaxy was reduced to abject poverty. And so the system broke down, the empire collapsed, and a sudden, long, sullen silence settled over 1 billion worlds, disturbed only by the pen scratchings of scholars as they laboured into the night over smug little treaties on the value of a planned political economy. Magrathea itself disappeared, and its memory soon passed into the obscurity of legend. In these enlightened times, of course, no one believes a word of it. Arthur awoke to the sound of an argument and went to the bridge. Ford was waving his arms around. "You're crazy, Zaphod," he was saying. "Magrathea is a myth, a fairy story. It's what parents tell their kids about at night if they want them to grow up to become economists. That's what we're currently in orbit around," insisted Zaphod. "Look, I can't help what you may personally be in orbit around," said Ford, "but this ship, computer, oh no." "Hi there, this is Eddie, your shipboard computer, and I'm feeling just great, guys, and I know I'm just gonna get a bundle of kicks out of any program you care to run through me." Arthur looked inquiringly at Trillian. She motioned to him to come on in, but keep quiet. "Computer," said Zaphod, "tell us again what our present trajectory is." "A real pleasure, feller," it burbled. "We are currently in orbit at an altitude of 300 miles around the legendary planet of Magrathea." "Proving nothing," said Ford. "I wouldn't trust that computer to speak my weight." "I can do that for you, sure," enthused the computer, punching out more ticker tape. "I can even work out your personality problems to 10 decimal places if it'll help." Trillian interrupted. "Zaphod," she said, "any minute now we'll be springing round to the daylight side of this planet," adding, "whatever it turns out to be." "Hey, what do you mean by that? The planet's where I predicted it would be, isn't it?" "Yes, I know there's a planet there. I'm not arguing with anyone. It's just that I wouldn't know Magrathea from any other lump of cold rock." "Dawn's coming up, if you want it." Okay, muttered Zaphod. "Let's at least give our eyes a good time. Computer, hi there, what can I just shut up and give us a view of the planet again?" The dark, featureless mass once more filled the screens, the planet rolling away beneath them. They watched for a moment in silence, but Zaphod was fidgety with excitement. "We're now traversing the night side," he said in a hushed voice. The planet rolled on. "The surface of the planet is now 300 miles beneath us," he continued. He was trying to restore a sense of occasion to what he felt could be a great moment. "Magrathea." He was piqued by Ford's skeptical reaction. "Magrathea. In a few seconds," he continued, "we should see there." The moment carried itself. Even the most seasoned star tramp can't help but shiver at the spectacular drama of a sunrise seen from space. But a binary sunrise is one of the marvels of the galaxy. Out of the utter blackness stabbed a sudden point of blinding light. It crept up by slight degrees and spread sideways into a thin crescent blade. and within seconds 2 suns were visible, furnaces of light, searing the black edge of the horizon with white fire. Fierce shafts of colour streaked through the thin atmosphere beneath them. The fires of dawn, breathed Zaphod. The twin sons of Sulianus and Ram. Or wherever, said Ford quietly. Sulianus and Ram, insisted Zaphod. The suns blazed into the pitch of space, and a low, ghostly music floated through the bridge. Marvin was humming ironically because he hated humans so much. As Ford gazed at the spectacle of light before them, burnt inside him. As Ford gazed at the spectacle of light before them, excitement burnt inside him, but only the excitement of seeing a strange new planet. It was enough for him to see it as it was. It faintly irritated him that Zaphod had to impose some ludicrous fantasy onto the scene to make it work for him. All this Magrathea nonsense seemed juvenile. Isn't it enough to see a garden as beautiful without having to believe there are fairies at the bottom of it too? All this Magrathea business seemed totally incomprehensible to Arthur. He edged up to Trillian and asked her what was going on. I only know what Zaphod's told me, she whispered. Apparently, Magrathea is some kind of legend from way back which no one seriously believes in. A bit like Atlantis on Earth, except that legends say the Magratheans used to manufacture planets. Arthur blinked at the screens and felt he was missing something important. Suddenly he realised what it was. Is there any tea on this spaceship? He asked. More of the planet was unfolding beneath them as the heart of gold streaked along its orbital path. The suns now stood high in the black sky. The pyrotechnics of dawn were over, and the surface of the planet appeared bleak and forbidding in the common light of day. Grey, dusty, and only dimly contoured, it looked dead and cold as a crypt. From time to time, promising features would appear on the distant horizon. Ravines, maybe mountains, maybe even cities. But as they approached, the lines would soften and blur into anonymity, and nothing would transpire. The planet's surface was blurred by time, by the slow movement of the thin, stagnant air that had crept across it for century upon century. Clearly, it was very, very old. A moment of doubt came to Ford as he watched the grey landscape move beneath him. The immensity of time worried him. He could feel it as a presence. He cleared his throat. Well, even supposing it is, said Zaphod. Which it isn't, continued Ford. What do you want with it anyway? There's nothing there. Not on the surface, said Zaphod. All right, just supposing there's something. I take it you're not here for the sheer industrial archaeology of it all. What are you after? One of Zaphod's heads looked away. The other one looked round to see what the first was looking at, but it wasn't looking at anything very much. Well, said Zaphod airily, there's partly the curiosity and partly a sense of adventure, but mostly I think it's the fame and the money. Ford glanced at him sharply. He got a very strong impression that Zaphod hadn't the faintest idea what he was there for at all. You know, I don't like the look of that planet at all, said Trillian, shivering. Take no notice, said Zaphod. With half the wealth of the former galactic empire stored on it somewhere, he can afford to look frumpy. Bullshit, thought Ford. Even supposing this was the home of some ancient civilization now gone to dust, even supposing a number of exceedingly unlikely things, there was no way that vast treasures of wealth were going to be stored there in any form that would still have meaning now. He shrugged. I think it's just a dead planet, he said. The suspense is killing me, said Arthur, testily. Stress and nervous tension are now serious social problems in all parts of the galaxy, and it's in order that this situation should not in any way be exacerbated that the following facts will now be revealed in advance. The planet in question is, in fact, the legendary Magrathea. The deadly missile attack shortly to be launched by an ancient automatic defense system will result merely in the breakage of 3 coffee cups and a mouse cage. The bruising of someone's upper arm, and the untimely creation and sudden demise of a bowl of petunias and an innocent sperm whale. In order that some sense of mystery should still be preserved, no revelation will yet be made concerning whose upper arm sustained the bruise. This fact may safely be made the subject of suspense, since it is of no significance whatsoever. I can't. After a fairly shaky start to the day, Arthur's mind was beginning to reassemble itself from the shell-shocked fragments the previous day had left him with. He had found a nutrimatic machine which had provided him with a plastic cup filled with a liquid that was almost but not quite entirely unlike tea. The way it functioned was very interesting. When the drink button was pressed, it made an instant but highly detailed examination of the subject's taste buds, a spectroscopic analysis of the subject's metabolism, and then sent tiny experimental signals down the neural pathways to the taste centers of the subject's brain to see what was likely to go down well. However, no one knew quite why it did this, because invariably it delivered a cupful of liquid that was almost but not quite entirely unlike tea. The Nutrimatic was designed and manufactured by the Sirius Cybernetics Corporation, whose complaints department now covers all major landmasses of the first three planets in the Sirius Tau star system. Arthur drank the liquid and found it reviving. He glanced up at the screens again and watched a few more 100 miles of barren greyness slide past. It suddenly occurred to him to ask a question which had been bothering him. "Is it safe?" he said. "Magrathea has been dead for 5 million years," said Zaphod. "Of course it's safe. Even the ghosts will settle down and raise families by now." At which point a strange and inexplicable sound trilled suddenly through the bridge, a noise a noise as of a distant fanfare, a hollow, reedy, insubstantial sound. It preceded a voice that was equally hollow, reedy, and insubstantial. The voice said, "Greetings to you." Someone from the dead planet was talking to them. "Computer," shouted Zaphod. "Hey there! What the Fodan is it?" "Oh, just some 5 million-year-old tape that's being broadcast at us." "A what? A recording?" "Shush," said Ford. "It's carrying on." The voice was old, courteous, almost charming, but it was underscored with quite unmistakable menace. "This is a recorded announcement," it said, "as I'm afraid we're all out at the moment. The Commercial Council of Magrathea thanks you for your esteemed visit." "A voice from ancient Magrathea," shouted Zaphod. Okay, said Ford. "But regrets," continued the voice, "that the entire planet is temporarily closed for business. Thank you. If you would care to leave your name and the address of a planet where you can be contacted, kindly speak when you hear this tone." A short buzz followed, and then silence. "They want to get rid of us," said Trillian nervously. "What do we do?" It's just a recording," said Zaphod. "We keep going. Got that, computer?" "I got it," said the computer, and gave the ship an extra kick of speed. They waited. After a second or so came the fanfare once again, and then the voice. "We would like to assure you that as soon as our business is resumed, announcements will be made in all fashionable magazines and colour supplements, when our clients will once again be able to select from all that's best in contemporary geography." The menace in the voice took on a sharper edge. "Meanwhile, we thank our clients for their kind interest and would ask them to leave now." Arthur looked round the nervous faces of his companions. "Well, I suppose we'd better be going then, hadn't we?" he suggested. "Shh," said Zaphod. "There's absolutely nothing to be worried about." "Then why is everyone so tense?" "Oh, they're just interested," shouted Zaphod. "Computer, start a descent into the atmosphere and prepare for landing." This time the fanfare was quite perfunctory, the voice distinctly cold. "It is most gratifying," it said, "that your enthusiasm for our planet continues unabated. So we would like to assure you that the guided missiles currently converging with your ship are part of a special service we extend to all of our most enthusiastic clients, and the fully armed nuclear warheads are, of course, merely a courtesy detail. We look forward to your custom in future lives. Thank you." The voice snapped off. "Oh," said Trillian. Said Arthur. "Well?" said Ford. "Look," said Zaphod, "will you get it into your heads? That's just a recorded message. It's millions of years old. It doesn't apply to us. Get it?" "What?" said Trilling quietly. "About the missiles." "Missiles! Don't make me laugh." Ford tapped Zaphod on the shoulder and pointed at the rear screen. Clear in the distance behind them, the two silver darts were climbing through the atmosphere towards the ship. A quick change of magnification brought them into close focus. Two massively real rockets thundering through the sky. The suddenness of it was shocking. I I think they're going to have a very good try at applying to us, said Ford. Zaphod stared at them in astonishment. Hey, this is terrific, he said. Someone down there is trying to kill us. Terrific, said Arthur. But don't you see what this means? Yes, we're going to die. Yeah, but apart from that. Apart from that? It means we must be onto something. How soon can we get off it? Second by second, the image of the missiles on the screen became larger. They had swung round now onto a direct homing course so that all could be seen ahead of them now was the warheads head-on. As a matter of interest, said Trillian, what are we going to do? Just keep cool, said Zaphod. Is that all? Shouted Arthur. No, we're also going to take evasive action, said Zaphod, with a sudden access of panic. Computer, what evasive action can we take? None, I'm afraid, guys, said the computer. Or something, said Zaphod. He said. There seems to be something jamming my guidance system, explained the computer brightly. Impact minus 45 seconds. Please call me Eddie if it'll help you relax. Zaphod tried to run in several equally decisive directions simultaneously. Right, he said. We've got to get manual control of this ship. Can you fly her? No. Can you? No. Trillian, can you? No. Fine, said Zaphod, relaxing. We'll do it together. I can't either, said Arthur, who felt it was time he began to insert himself. Yeah, I guessed that, said Zaphod. Okay, computer, I want full manual control now. You got it, said the computer. Several large desk panels slid open and banks of control consoles sprang up out of them, showering the crew with bits of expanded polystyrene packaging and balls of rolled-up cellophane. These controls had never been used before. Zaphod stared at them wildly. Okay, Ford, he said. Full retro thrust and 10 degrees starboard, or something. Good luck, guys, chirped the computer. Impact minus 30 seconds. Ford leapt the controls. Only a few of them made any immediate sense to him, so he pulled those. The ship shook and screamed as if its guidance rocket jets tried to push it every which way simultaneously. He released half of them, and the ship span around in a tight arc and headed back the way they'd come, straight towards the oncoming missiles. Air cushions ballooned out of walls in an instant as everyone was thrown against them. For a few seconds, the inertial forces held them flattened and squirming for breath, unable to move. Zaphod struggled and pushed in manic desperation and finally managed a savage kick at a small lever that formed part of the guidance system. The lever snapped off. The ship twisted sharply and rocketed upwards. The crew were hurled violently back across the cabin. Ford's copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy smashed into another section of the control console, with the combined result that the guide started to explain to anyone who cared to listen about the best ways of smuggling Antarian parakeet glands out of Antares. An Antarian parakeet gland stuck on a small stick is a revolting but much sought-after cocktail delicacy, and very large sums of money are often paid for them by very rich idiots who want to impress other very rich idiots. And the ship suddenly dropped out of the sky like a stone. It was, of course, more or less at this moment that one of the crew sustained a nasty bruise to the upper arm. This should be emphasized because, as has already been revealed, they escape otherwise completely unharmed, and the deadly nuclear missiles do not eventually hit the ship. The safety of the crew is absolutely assured. Impact minus 20 seconds, guys, said the computer. Then turn the bloody engines back on, bawled Zaphod. Okay, sure thing, guys, said the computer. With a subtle roar, the engines cut back in and the ship smoothly flattened out of its dive and headed back towards the missiles again. The computer started to sing, When you walk through the storm, he wailed nasally, hold your head up high. Zaphod screamed at it to shut up, but his voice was lost in the din of what they quite naturally assumed was approaching destruction. And don't be afraid of the dark, Eddie wailed. The ship, in flattening out, had in fact flattened out upside down, and lying on the ceiling as they were, it was now totally impossible for any of the crew to reach the guidance systems. At the end of the storm, crooned Eddie. The two missiles loomed massively on the screens as they thundered towards the ship. Is a golden sky. But by an extraordinary lucky chance, they had not fully corrected their flight paths to that of the erratically weaving ship, and they passed right under it. And the sweet silver songs of the larks, revised impact time 15 seconds, fellas. Walk on through the wind. The missiles banked round in a screeching arc and plunged back into pursuit. "This is it," said Arthur, watching them. "We are now quite definitely going to die, aren't we?" "I wish you'd stop saying that," shouted Ford. "Well, we are, aren't we?" "Yes." "Walk on through the rain," sang Eddie. A thought struck Arthur. He struggled to his feet. "Why doesn't anyone turn on this improbability drive thing?" he said. "We could probably reach that." "What, are you crazy?" said Zaphod. "Without proper programming, anything could happen." "Well, does that matter at this stage?" shouted Arthur. "Through your dreams, be tossed and blown." Arthur scrambled up onto one end of the excitingly chunky pieces of moulded contouring where the curve of the wall met the ceiling. Walk on, with hope in your heart." "Does anyone know why Arthur can't turn on the improbability drive?" shouted Trillian. "And you'll never walk alone." Impact minus 5 seconds. "It's been great knowing you guys. God bless." "You'll never walk alone." "I said," yelled Trillian. "Does anyone know?" The next thing that happened was a mid-mangling explosion of noise and light. And the next thing that happened after that was that the Heart of Gold continued on its way perfectly normally with a rather fetchingly redesigned interior. It was somewhat larger and done out in delicate pastel shades of green and blue. In the centre, a spiral staircase leading nowhere in particular stood in a spray of ferns and yellow flowers next to it, and next to it, a stone sundial pedestal housed the main computer terminal. Cunningly deployed lighting and mirrors created the illusion of standing in a conservatory overlooking a wide stretch of exquisitely manicured garden. Around the periphery of the conservatory area stood marble-topped tables on intricately beautifully wrought iron legs. As you gazed into the polished surface of the marble, the vague forms of instruments became visible, and as you touched them, the instruments materialized instantly under your hands. Looked at from the correct angles, the mirrors appeared to reflect all the required data readouts, though it was far from clear where they were reflected from. It was, in fact, sensationally beautiful. Relaxing in a wickerwork sun chair, Zaphod Beeblebrock said, "What the hell happened?" "Well, I was just saying," said Arthur, lounging by a small fish pool. "There's this improbability drive switch over here." He waved at where it had now been. There was a potted plant there now. "But where are we?" said Ford, who was sitting on the spiral staircase, a nicely chilled Pan-Galactic gargle blaster in his hand. "Exactly where we were, I think," said Trillian. As all about them, the mirrors showed them an image of the blighted landscape of Magrathea, which still scooted along beneath them. Zaphod leapt out of his seat. "Then what's happened to the missiles?" he said. A new and astounding image appeared in the mirrors. "They would appear," said Ford doubtfully, "to have turned into a bowl of petunias and a very surprised-looking whale." "At an improbability factor," cut in Eddie, who hadn't changed a bit, "of 8,767,128 to 1 against." Zaphod stared at Arthur. "Did you think of that, Earthman?" he demanded. "Well," said Arthur, all I did was, that's very good thinking, you know. Turn on the improbability drive a second without first activating the proofing screens. Hey, kid, you just saved our lives, you know that?" "Oh," said Arthur. "Well, it was nothing, really." "Was it?" said Zaphod. "Ah, well, forget it then. Okay, computer, take us into land." "But," I said, "forget it." Another thing that got forgotten was the fact that against all probability a sperm whale had suddenly been called into existence several miles above the surface of an ancient planet. And since this is not a naturally tenable position for a whale, this poor innocent creature had very little time to come to terms with its identity as a whale before it then had to come to terms with not being a whale anymore. This is a complete record of its thoughts. From the moment it began its life till the moment it ended it. "Ah, what's happening?" it thought. Um, excuse me, who am I? Hello, why am I here? What's my purpose in life?" "What do I mean by who am I?" "Calm down, get a grip now. Oh, this is an interesting sensation. What is it?" "It's a sort of yawning, tingling sensation in my oh, well, I suppose I better start finding names for things if I want to make any headway, and what for the sake of what I should call an argument, I should call the world. So let's call it my stomach. Good. Oh, it's getting quite strong. And hey, what's this roaring sound going past what I'm suddenly going to call my head? Perhaps I can call that wind. Is that a good name? It'll do. Perhaps I've found a better name for it later, when I've found out what it's for. It must be something very important, because there certainly seems to be a hell of a lot of it. Hey, what's this thing? Hey, let's call it a tail. Yeah, tail. Hey, I could really thrash it about pretty good, can't I? Wow, that feels pretty great. Doesn't seem to achieve very much, but I'll probably find out what it's for later on. Now, have I built up any coherent picture of things yet? No, never mind. Hey, this is really exciting. So much to find out about. So much to look forward to. I'm quite dizzy with anticipation. Or is it the wind? There's really a lot of it now, isn't it? And wow, hey, what's this thing suddenly coming towards me very fast? Very, very fast. So big and flat and round. It needs a big, wide-sounding name like round, ground. That's it. That's a good name, ground. I wonder if it'll be friends with me. And the rest, after a sudden wet thud, was silence. Curiously enough, the only thing that went through the mind of the bowl of petunias as it fell was, "Oh no, not again." Many people have speculated that if we knew exactly why the bowl of petunias had thought that, we would know a lot more about the nature of the universe than we do now. "Are we taking this robot with us?" said Ford, looking with distaste at Marvin, who was standing in an awkward hunched posture in the corner under a small palm tree. Zaphod glanced away from the mirror screen, which presented a panoramic view of the blighted landscape on which the Heart of Gold had now landed. "Oh yeah, the paranoid android," he said. "Yeah, we'll take him." "But what are we supposed to do with a manically depressed robot?" "You think you've got problems," said Marvin, as if he was addressing a newly occupied coffin. "What are you supposed to do if you are a manically depressed robot? No, don't bother to answer that. I'm 50,000 times more intelligent than you, and even I don't know the answer. It gives me a headache just trying to think down to your level." Trillian burst in through the door from her cabin. "My wife's mice have escaped." An expression of deep worry and concern failed to cross either of Zaphod's faces. "Nuts to your white mice," he said. Trillian glared an upset glare at him and disappeared again. It's possible that her remark would have commanded greater attention had it been generally realized that human beings were only the third most intelligent life form present on the planet Earth, instead of, as was generally thought by most independent observers, the second. "Good afternoon, boys." The voice was oddly familiar, but oddly different. It had a matriarchal twang. It announced that to the crew as they arrived at the airlock hatchway that would let them out onto the planet. They looked at each other in puzzlement. "It's the computer," explained Zaphod. "I discovered it had an emergency backup personality that I thought might work out better." "Now, this is going to be your first day out on a strange new planet," continued Eddie's new voice, "so I want you all wrapped up snug and warm, and no plague with any naughty bug-eyed monsters." Zaphod tapped impatiently on the hatch. "I'm sorry," he said. "I think we might be better off with a slide rule." "Right," snapped the computer. "Who said that?" "Will you open the exit hatch, please, computer?" said Zaphod, trying not to get angry. "Not until whoever said that owns up," urged the computer, stamping a few synapses closed. "Oh, God," muttered Ford, slumped against a bulkhead and started to count to 10. He was desperately worried that one day sentient life forms would forget how to do this. Only by counting could humans demonstrate their independence of computers. "Come on," said Eddie sternly. "Computer," began Zaphod. "I'm waiting," interrupted Eddie. "I can wait all day if necessary." "Computer," said Zaphod again, who had been trying to think of some subtle pieces of reasoning to put the computer down with, and had decided not to bother competing with it on its own ground. "If you don't open that exit hatch this moment, I shall zap straight off to your major databanks and reprogram you with a very large axe. Got it?" Eddie, shocked, paused and considered this. Ford carried on, counting quietly. "This is about the most aggressive thing you can do to a computer. It's the equivalent of going up to a human being and saying, 'Blood, blood, blood.'" Finally, Eddie said quietly, I can see this relationship is something we're all going to have to work at. And the hatchway opened. An icy wind ripped into them. They hugged themselves warmly and stepped down the ramp onto the barren dust of Magrathea. "It'll all end in tears, I know it," shouted Eddie after them and closed the hatchway again. A few minutes later, he opened and closed the hatchway again in response to a command that caught him entirely by surprise. 5 figures wandered slowly over the blighted land. Bits of it were dullish grey, bits of it dullish brown, the rest of it rather less interesting to look at. It was like a dried-out marsh, now barren of all vegetation and covered with a layer of dust about an inch thick. It was very cold. Zaphod was clearly rather depressed about it. He stalked off by himself and was soon lost to sight behind a slight rise in the ground. The wind stung Arthur's eyes and ears, and the stale, thin air clasped at his throat. However, the thing struck most was his mind. "It's fantastic," he said, and his own voice rattled in his ears. Sound carried badly in this thin atmosphere. "Desolate hole, if you ask me," said Ford. "I could have more fun in cat litter." He felt a mounting irritation. Of all the planets, of all the star systems, of all the galaxy, didn't he just have to turn up at the dump like this after 15 years of being a castaway? Not even a hot dog stand in evidence. He stooped down and picked up a cold clot of earth, but there was nothing underneath it worth crossing thousands of light years to look at. "No," insisted Arthur. "Don't you understand? This is the first time I've actually stood on the surface of another planet. A whole alien world. Pity it's such a dump, though." Trillian hugged herself, shivered, and frowned. She could have sworn she saw a slight and unexpected movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she glanced in that direction, all she could see was the ship, still and silent 100 yards or so behind them. She was relieved when a second or so later they caught sight of Zaphod standing on top of the ridge of ground and waving to them to come and join him. He seemed to be excited, but they couldn't clearly hear what he was saying because of the thinnish atmosphere and the wind. As they approached the ridge of higher ground, they became aware that it seemed to be circular, a crater about 150 yards wide. Round the outside of the crater, the sloping ground was spattered with black and red lumps. They stopped and looked at it a piece. It was wet, it was rubbery, and with horror they suddenly realized that it was fresh whale meat. At the top of the crater's lip they met Zaphod. "Look," he said, pointing into the crater. In the crater lay the exploded carcass of a lonely sperm whale that hadn't lived long enough to be disappointed with its lot. The silence was only disturbed by the slight involuntary spasms at Trillian's throat. "I suppose there's no point in trying to bury it," murmured Arthur, and wished he hadn't. "Come on," said Zaphod, and started back down into the crater. "What, down there?" said Trillian, with severe distaste. "Yeah," said Zaphod. "Come on, I've got something to show you." "We can see it," said Trillian. "Not that," said Zaphod. "Something else. Come on." They all hesitated. "Come on," insisted Zaphod. "I've found a way in." "In?" said Arthur in horror. Into the interior of the planet. An underground passage. The force of the whale's impact cracked it open, and that's where we have to go, where no man has trod these 5 million years into the very depths of time itself. Marvin started his ironical humming again. Zaphod hit him and he shut up. With little shudders of disgust, they all followed Zaphod down the incline into the crater, trying very hard not to look at its unfortunate creator. "Life," said Marvin dolefully. "Loathe it or leave it. Loathe it or ignore it. You can't like it." The ground had caved in, where the whale had hit it, revealing a network of galleries and passages, now largely obstructed by collapsed rubble and entrails. Zaphod had made a start clearing a way into one of them, but Marvin was able to do it rather faster. Dank air wafted out of its dark recesses, and Zaphod shone a torch into it. Little was visible in the dusty gloom. "According to the legends," he said, "Magratheans live most of their life in the ground." "Why is that?" said Arthur. "Did the surface become too polluted or overpopulated?" "No, I don't think so," said Zaphod. "I think they just didn't like it very much." "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" said Trillian, peering nervously into the darkness. "We've been attacked once already, you know." "Look, kid, I promise you the life population of this planet is nil, plus the 4 of us. So come on, let's get on in there. Uh, hey, Earthman. Hey, Earthman." "Arthur," said Arthur. "Yeah, Could you just sort of keep this robot with you and guard the end of the passageway, okay? Guard? Said Arthur. What from? You just said there was no one here. Yeah, well, just for safety, okay? Said Zaphod. Whose? Yours or mine? Good lad. Okay, here we go. Zaphod scrambled down the passage, followed by Trillian and Ford. Well, I hope you all have a really miserable time, complained Arthur. Don't worry, Marvin assured him. They will. In a few seconds, they disappeared from view. Arthur stamped around in a huff and then decided that a whale's graveyard is not on the whole a good place to stamp around in. Marvin eyed him balefully for a moment and then turned himself off. Zaphod marched quickly down the passageway, nervous as hell, but trying to hide it by striding purposefully. He flung the torch beams around. The walls were covered in dark tiles and were cold to the touch, the air thick with decay. There, what did I tell you? He said. An inhabited planet. Magrathea. And he strode on through the dirt and debris that littered the tile floor. Trillium was reminded unavoidably of the London Underground, though it was less thoroughly squalid. At intervals along the walls, the tiles gave way to large mosaics, simple angular patterns in bright colours. Trillian stopped and studied one of them, but she could not interpret any of them. She called to Zaphod. Hey, have you any idea what these strange symbols are? Yeah, I think they're strange symbols of some kind, said Zaphod, hardly glancing back. Trillian shrugged and hurried after him. From time to time, a doorway led either to the left or right into smallish chambers, which Ford discovered to be full of derelict computer equipment. He dragged Zaphod into one to have a look. Trillian followed. Look, said Ford, you reckon this is Magrathea? Yeah, said Zaphod, and we heard a voice, right? Okay, so I've bought the fact that it's Magrathea, for the moment. What you have so far said nothing about is how in the galaxy you found it. You didn't just look it up in a star atlas, that's for sure. Research, government archives, detective work. Few lucky guesses. Easy. And then you stole the heart of gold to come and look for it with. I stole it to look for a lot of things. A lot of things, said Ford in surprise. Like what? I don't know. What? I don't know what I'm looking for. Why not? Because I think I might be because if I knew I wouldn't be able to look for them. What? Are you crazy? It's a possibility I haven't ruled out yet, said David quietly. I only know as much about myself as my mind can work out under its current conditions, and its current conditions are not good. For a long time nobody said anything as Ford gazed at Zaphod with a mind suddenly full of worry. Listen, old friend, if you want to, started Ford eventually. No, wait, look, I'll tell you something, said Zaphod. I freewheel a lot. You know, I get an idea to do something, and hey, why not? I do it. I reckon I'll become president of the galaxy, and it just happens. It's easy. I decide to steal this ship. I decide to look for Magrathea, and it all happens. Yeah, I work out how it can best be done, right? But it always works out. It's like having a galactic credit card which keeps on working though you never send off the checks. And then whenever I stop and think, why did I want to do something? How did I work out how to do it? I get a very strong desire just to stop thinking about it. Like I have now. It's a big effort to talk about it. Zaphod paused for a while. For a while there was silence. Then he frowned and said, last night I was worrying about this again. I felt about the fact that part of my mind just didn't seem to work properly. Then it occurred to me that the way it seemed was that someone else was using my mind to have good ideas without telling me about it. I put the two ideas together and decided that maybe somebody had locked off part of my mind for that purpose, which was why I couldn't use it. I wondered if there was a way I could check. I went to the ship's medical bay and plugged myself into the encephalographic screen. I went through every major screening test on both my heads. All the tests I had to go through under government medical officers before my nomination for presidency could be properly ratified. They showed up nothing unexpected at least. They showed that I was clever, imaginative, irresponsible, untrustworthy, extrovert, nothing you couldn't have guessed, and no other anomalies. So I started inventing further tests completely at random. Nothing. Then I tried superimposing the results from one head on top of the results from the other head. Still nothing. Finally I got silly because I'd given it all up
I was more than I'd given it all up as nothing more than an attack of paranoia. The last thing I did before I packed it in was take a superimposed picture and look at it through a green filter. You remember I was always superstitious about the colour green when I was a kid? I always wanted to be a pilot and one of the trading scouts.
Ford nodded.
And there it was, said Zaphod, clear as day. A whole section in the middle of both brains that related only to each other and not to anything else around them. Some bastard had cauterized the synapses and electronically traumatized those two lumps of cerebellum.
Ford stared at him, aghast. Trillian had turned white. Somebody did that to you? Whispered Ford.
Yeah.
But have you any idea who? Or why?
Why, I can only guess. But I do know who the bastard was.
You know? How do you know?
Because they left their initials burned into the cauterized synapses. They left them there for me to see.
Ford stared at him in horror and felt his skin begin to crawl. Initials? Burnt into your brain?
Yeah.
Well, what were they, for God's sake?
Zaphod looked at him in silence again for a moment, then he looked away. ZB, he said. At that moment, a steel shutter slammed down behind them, and gas started to pour into the chamber. I'll tell you about it later, choked Zaphod as all three passed out.
On the surface of Magrathea, Arthur wandered about moodily. Ford had thoughtfully left him his copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to while away the time with. He pushed a few buttons at random. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a very unevenly edited book and contains many passages that simply seemed to its editors like a good idea at the time. One of these, the one Arthur now came across, supposedly relates the experience of one Vít Vujagig, a quiet young student at the University of Maximeglan who pursued a brilliant academic career studying ancient philosophy, transformational ethics, and the wave harmonic theory of historical perception, and then, after a night of drinking pangalactic gargle blasters with Zaphod Beeblebrox, became increasingly obsessed with the problem of what had happened to all the biros he bought over the past few years. There followed a long period of painstaking research during which he visited all the major centres of biro loss throughout the galaxy and eventually came up with a quaint little theory which quite caught the public imagination at the time. Somewhere in the cosmos, he said, along with all the planets inhabited by humanoids, reptiloids, fishoids, walking trioids, and superintelligent shades of the colour blue, there was also a planet entirely given over to biro life forms. And it was to this planet that unattended biros would make their way, slipping away quietly through wormholes in space to a world where they knew they could enjoy a uniquely biroid lifestyle, responding to highly biro-oriented stimuli and generally leading the biro equivalent of the good life. How many times can you say biro? And as theories go, this was all fine. And this was all very fine and pleasant until Vít Vujagig suddenly claimed to have found this planet and to have worked there for a while driving a limousine for a family of cheap green retractables, whereupon he was taken away, locked up, wrote a book, and was finally sent into tax exile, which is the usual fate reserved for those who are determined to make a fool of themselves in public. When one day an expedition was sent to the spatial coordinates that Vujagig had claimed for this planet, they discovered only a small asteroid inhabited by a solitary old man who claimed repeatedly that nothing was true, even though he was later discovered to be lying. There did, however, remain the question of both the mysterious 60,000 Alterian dollars paid yearly into his Brantisvogen bank account, and of course Zaphod Beeblebrox's highly profitable second-hand biro business. Arthur read this and put the book down. The robot still sat there, completely inert. Arthur got up and walked to the top of the crater. He walked around the crater. He watched two suns set magnificently over Magrathea. He went back down into the crater. He woke the robot up because even a manically depressed robot is better to talk to than nobody. "Night's falling," he said. "Look, robot, the stars are coming out." From the heart of a dark nebula, it is possible to see very few stars and only very faintly, but they were there to be seen. The robot obediently looked at them and then looked back. "I know," he said. "Wretched, isn't it? But that sunset! I've never seen anything like it in my wildest dreams.
2 suns. It was like mountains of fire boiling into space. I've seen it, said Marvin. It's rubbish. We only ever had the one sun at home, persevered Arthur. I came from a planet called Earth, you know. I know, said Marvin. You keep going on about it. It sounds awful. Oh, no, it was a beautiful place. Did it have oceans? Oh, yes, said Arthur with a sigh. Great, wide, rolling blue oceans. Can't bear oceans, said Marvin. Tell me, inquired Arthur, do you get on well with other robots? Hate them, said Marvin. Where are you going? Arthur couldn't bear any more. He had got up again. I think I'll just take another walk, he said. Don't blame you, said Marvin, and counted 597,000 million sheep before falling asleep again a second later. Arthur slapped his arms about himself to try and get his circulation a little more enthusiastic about his job. He trudged back up the wall of the crater. Because the atmosphere was so thin and because there was no moon, nightfall was very rapid and it was by now very dark. Because of this, Arthur practically walked into the old man before he noticed him. He was standing with his back to Arthur, watching the very last glimmers of light sink into blackness behind the horizon. He was tallish, elderly, and dressed in a single long grey robe. When he turned, his face was thin and distinguished, careworn but not unkind, the sort of face you would happily bank with. But he didn't turn yet, not even to react to Arthur's yelp of surprise. Eventually, the last rays of the sun had vanished completely, and he turned. His face was still illuminated from somewhere, and when Arthur looked for the source of the light, he saw that a few yards away stood a small craft of some kind, a small hovercraft. Arthur guessed. It shed a dim pool of light around him. The man looked at Arthur sadly, it seemed. Ah, you choose a cold night to visit our dead planet, he said. Who are you? Stammered Arthur. The man looked away. Again, a kind of sadness seemed to cross his face. My name is not important, he said. He seemed to have something on his mind. Conversation was clearly something he felt he didn't have to rush at. Arthur felt awkward. You startled me, he said lamely. The man looked round to him again and slightly raised his eyebrows. He said. I said you startled me. Do not be alarmed, I will not harm you. Arthur frowned at him. But you shot at us. There were missiles, he said. The man chuckled slightly. An automated system, he said, and gave a small sigh. Ancient computers, ranged in the dark bowels of the planet, tick away the dark millennia, and the ages hang heavy on their dusty databanks. I think they take the occasional pot shot to relieve the monotony. He looked gravely at Arthur and said, I'm a great fan of science, you know. Oh, really? Said Arthur, who was beginning to find the man's curious, kindly manner disconcerting. Oh, yes, said the old man, and simply stopped talking again. Ah, said Arthur. He had an odd feeling of being like a man in the act of adultery who is surprised when the woman's husband wanders into the room, changes his trousers, passes a few idle remarks about the weather, and leaves again. You seem ill at ease, said the old man with polite concern. No. Well, yes. Actually, you see, we weren't really expecting to find any about. In fact, I sort of gathered that you were all dead or something. Dead? Said the old man. Good gracious, no. We have but slept. Slept? Said Arthur incredulously. Yes, through the economic recession, you see, said the old man, apparently unconcerned about whether Arthur understood a word he was talking about or not. Economic recession? Well, you see, 5 million years ago, the galactic economy collapsed, and seeing that custom-made planets are something of a luxury commodity, you see. He paused and looked at Arthur. You knew we built planets, do you? He asked solemnly. Well, yes, said Arthur. I sort of gathered. Fascinating trade, said the old man, and a wistful look came into his eyes. Doing the coastlines was always my favourite. Used to have endless fun doing the little bits and fjords. So anyway, he said, trying to find his thread again, the recession came and we decided it would save us a lot of bother if we just slept through it. So we programmed the computers to revive us when it was over. The man stifled a very slight yawn and continued. The computers were index linked to the galactic stock market prices, you see, so that it would all be revived when everybody else had rebuilt the economy enough to afford our rather expensive services. Arthur, a regular Guardian reader, was deeply shocked at this. That's a pretty unpleasant way to behave, isn't it? Is it? Said the old man mildly. I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of touch. He pointed down into the crater. Is that robot yours? He said. No, came a thin metallic voice from the crater. I'm mine. If you call it a robot, muttered Arthur, it's more a sort of electronic sulking machine. Bring it, said the old man. Arthur was quite surprised to hear a note of decision suddenly present in the old man's voice. He called to Marvin, who crawled up the slope, making a big show of being lame, which he wasn't. On second thoughts, said the old man, leave it here. You must come with me. Great things are afoot. He turned towards his craft, which, though no apparent signal had been given, now drifted quietly towards them through the dark. Arthur looked down at Marvin, who now made an equally big show of turning round laboriously and trudging off down into the crater again, muttering sour nothings to himself. Come, called the old man. Come now, or you're going to be late. Late? Said Arthur. What for? What is your name, human? Dent, Arthur Dent, said Arthur. Late, as in the late Dent Arthur Dent, said the old man sternly. It's a sort of threat, you see. Another wistful look came into his tired old eyes. I've never been very good at them myself, but I'm told they can be very effective. Arthur blinked at him. What an extraordinary person, he muttered to himself. I beg your pardon, said the old man. Oh, nothing, I'm sorry, said Arthur in embarrassment. All right, where do we go? In my air car, said the old man, motioning Arthur to get into the craft, which had settled silently next to them. We are going deep into the bowels of the planet, when even now our race is being revived from its 5 million-year slumber. Magrathea awakes. Arthur shivered involuntarily as he seated himself next to the old man. The strangeness of it, the silent bobbing movements of the craft as it soared into the night sky, quite unsettled him. He looked at the old man, his face illuminated by the dull glow of tiny lights on the instrument panel. Excuse me, he said to him. What is your name, by the way? My name, said the old man, and the same distant sadness came into his face again. He paused. My name, he said, is Slarty Bartfast. Arthur practically choked. I beg your pardon? Slarty Bartfast, repeated the old man quietly. Slarty Bartfast? The old man looked at him gravely. I said it wasn't important, he said. The air car sailed through the night. It is an important and popular fact that things are not always what they seem. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was more intelligent than dolphins because he'd achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on, whilst all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water having a good time. Conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man for precisely the same reasons. Curiously enough, the dolphins had long known of the impending destruction of the planet Earth and had made many attempts to alert mankind of the danger, but most of their communications were misinterpreted as amusing attempts to punch footballs or whistle for titbits, so they eventually gave up and left the Earth by their own means shortly before the Vogons arrived. The last Earth dolphin message was misinterpreted as a surprisingly sophisticated attempt to do a double backward somersault through a hoop whilst whistling the Star-Spangled Banner. But in fact the message was this: so long, and thanks for all the fish. In fact, there was only one species on the planet more intelligent than dolphins, and they spent a lot of their time in behavioural research laboratories, running round inside wheels and conducting frighteningly elegant and subtle experiments on man. The fact that once again man completely misinterpreted this relationship was entirely according to these creatures' plans. Silently the air car coasted through the cold darkness, a single soft glow of light that was utterly alone in the deep Magrathean night. It sped swiftly. Arthur's companion seemed sunk in his own thoughts, and when Arthur tried on a couple of occasions to engage him in conversation again, he would simply reply by asking if he was comfortable enough, and then left it at that. Arthur tried to gauge the speed at which they were travelling, but the blackness outside was absolute, and he was denied any reference points. The sense of motion was so soft and slight he could almost believe they were hardly moving at all. Then a tiny glow of light appeared in the far distance, and within seconds had grown so much in size that Arthur realized it was travelling towards them at colossal speed, and he tried to make out what sort of craft it might be. He peered at it, but was unable to discern any clear shape, and suddenly gasped in alarm as the aircraft dipped sharply and headed downwards in what seemed certain to be a collision course. Their relative velocity seemed unbelievable, and Arthur had hardly time to draw breath before it was all over. The next thing he was aware of was an insane silver blur that seemed to surround him. He twisted his head sharply round and saw a small black point dwindling rapidly in the distance behind them, and it took him several seconds to realise what had happened. They had plunged into a tunnel in the ground. The colossal speed had been their own relative to the glow of light, which was the colossal speed had been relative to the glow of light, which was stationary hole in the ground, the mouth of the tunnel. The insane blur of silver was the circular wall of the tunnel down which they were shooting, apparently at several hundred miles an hour. He closed his eyes in horror. He closed his eyes in terror. After a length of time which he made no attempt to judge, he sensed a slight subsidence in their speed, and some while later became aware that they were gracefully and gradually gliding to a gentle halt. He opened his eyes again. They were still in the silver tunnel, threading and weaving their way through what appeared to be a criss-cross warren of converging tunnels. When they finally stopped, it was in a small chamber of curved steel. Several tunnels had also had their terminus here, and at the farthest end of the chamber, Arthur could see a large circle of dim, irritating light. It was irritating because it played tricks with the eyes. It was impossible to focus on it properly or tell how near or far it was. Arthur guessed, quite wrongly, that it might be ultraviolet. Slarty Bartfast turned and regarded Arthur with his solemn old eyes. "Earthman," he said, "we are now deep in the heart of Magrathea." "How did you know I was an Earthman?" demanded Arthur. These things will become clear to you, said the old man gently. "At least," he added with slight doubt in his voice, "clearer than they are at the moment." He continued, "I should warn you that the chamber we are about to pass into does not literally exist within our planet. It is a little too large. We are about to pass through a gateway into a vast tract of hyperspace. It may disturb you." Arthur made nervous noises. Slarty Barfast touched a button and added not entirely reassuringly, "It scares the willies out of me. Hold tight." The car shot forward straight into the circle of light, and suddenly Arthur had a fairly clear idea of what infinity looked like. It wasn't infinity, in fact. Infinity itself looks flat and uninteresting. Looking up into the night sky is looking into infinity. Distance is incomprehensible and therefore meaningless. The chamber into which the air car emerged was anything but infinite. It was just very, very big, so that it gave an impression of infinity far better than infinity itself. Arthur's senses bobbed and span, and travelling at the immense speed he knew the air car attained, they climbed slowly through the open air, leaving the gateway through which they had passed an invisible pinprick in the shimmering wall behind them. The wall. The wall defied the imagination, seduced it and defeated it. The wall was so paralysingly vast and sheer that its top, bottom and sides passed away beyond the reach of sight. The mere shock of vertigo could kill a man. The wall appeared perfectly flat. It would take the finest laser measuring equipment to detect that as it climbed apparently to infinity. As it dropped dizzily away, as it planed out to either side, it also curved. It met itself again 13 light seconds away. In other words, the wall formed the inside of a hollow sphere, a sphere over 3 million miles across, and flooded with unimaginable light. "Welcome," said Slarty Bartfast, as the tiny speck that was the air car, travelling now at 3 times the speed of sound, crept imperceptibly forward into the mind-boggling space. "Welcome," he said, "to our factory floor." Arthur stared about him in a kind of wonderful horror. Ranged away before them at distances he could neither judge nor even guess at were a series of curious suspensions. Delicate traceries of metal and light hung about shadowy spherical shapes that hung in space. "This," said Slarty Bartfast, "is where we make most of our planet, you see." "You mean?" said Arthur, trying to form the words. You mean you're starting it all up again now? Oh, no, no. Good heavens, no, exclaimed the old man. No, the galaxy isn't nearly rich enough to support us yet. No, we've been awakened to perform just one extraordinary commission for very special clients from another dimension. It may interest you. There, in the distance in front of us. Arthur followed the old man's finger till he was able to pick out the floating structure he was pointing at. It was indeed the only one of the many structures that betrayed any sign of activity about it, though this was more a subliminal impression than anything one could put one's finger on. At the moment, however, a flash of light arced through the structure and revealed in stark relief the patterns that were formed in the dark sphere within. Patterns that Arthur knew, rough, blobby shapes that were as familiar to him as the shapes of worlds, part of the furniture of his mind. For a few seconds he sat in stunned silence as the images rushed around his mind and tried to find somewhere to settle down and make sense. Part of his brain told him that he knew perfectly well what he was looking at and what the shapes represented, whilst another quite sensibly refused to countenance the idea and abdicated responsibility for any further thinking in that direction. The flash came again, and this time there could be no doubt. "The Earth," whispered Arthur. "Well, the Earth Mark II, in fact," said Slarty Bartfast cheery. "We're making a copy from our own original blueprints." There was a pause. "Are you trying to tell me," said Arthur slowly and with control, "that you originally made the Earth?" "Oh, yes," said Slarty Bartfast. "Did you ever go to a place, I think it was called Norway?" "No," said Arthur. "No, I didn't." "Pity," said Slarty Bartfast. "That was one of mine. Won an award, you know. Lovely crinkly edges. I was most upset to hear about its destruction." "You were upset?" "Yes. 5 minutes later, it wouldn't have mattered so much. It was quite a shocking cock-up." "Huh?" said Arthur. "The mice were furious." "The mice were furious?" "Oh, yes," said the old man mildly. "Yes, well, so I expect with the dogs and cats and duck-billed platypuses, but—" "But they hadn't paid for it, you see, had they?" "Look," said Arthur, "would it save you a lot of time if I just gave up and went mad now?" For a while the air car flew on in awkward silence. Then the old man tried patiently to explain. "Earthman, the planet you lived on was commissioned and paid for and run by mice. It was destroyed 5 minutes before the completion of the purpose for which it was built, and we've got to build another one." Only one word registered with Arthur. "Mice?" he said. "Indeed, Earthman." "Look, sorry, are we talking about the little white furry things with the cheese fixation and women standing on tables screaming in the early 60s sitcoms?" Slarty Bartfast coughed politely. "Earthman," he said, "it is sometimes hard to follow your mode of speech. Remember, I have been asleep inside the planet of Magrathea for 5 million years and know little of these early 60s sitcoms of which you speak. These creatures you called mice, you see, they are not quite as they appear. They are merely the protrusion into our dimension of vast, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. The whole business with the cheese and the squeaking is just a front." The old man paused and with a sympathetic frown continued. They've been experimenting on you, I'm afraid." Arthur thought about this for a second, then his face cleared. "Ah, no," he said. "I see the source of misunderstanding now. No, look, you see, what happened was that we used to do experiments on them. They were often used in behavioral research, Pavlov and all that sort of stuff. So what happened was that the mice would be set all sorts of tests, learning to ring bells, run round mazes and things so that the whole nature of the learning process could be examined. From our observations of their behaviour, we were able to learn all sorts of things about us, our own..." Arthur's voice tailed off. "Ha! Such subtlety," said Slarty Bartfast. "One really has to admire it." "What?" said Arthur. "How better to disguise their real natures, and how better to guide your thinking. Suddenly running down a maze the wrong way, eating the wrong bit of cheese, unexpectedly dropping dead of myxomatosis. If it's finely calculated, the cumulative effect is enormous." He paused for effect. "You see, Earthman, They really are particularly clever, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. Your planet and people have formed the matrix of an organic computer running a 10 million year research program. Let me tell you the whole story. It'll take a little time. Time, said Arthur weakly, is not currently one of my problems. There are, of course, many problems connected with life, of which some of the most popular are: why are people born? Why do they die? Why do they want to spend so much of the intervening time wearing digital watches? Many, many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings whose physical manifestation in their own pan-dimensional universe is not too dissimilar to our own, got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life, which used to interrupt their favourite pastime of Brocchian ultra cricket, a curious game which involves suddenly hitting people for no readily apparent reason and then running away, that they decided to sit down and solve their problems once and for all. And to this end, they built themselves a stupendous supercomputer, which was so amazingly intelligent that even before the databanks had been connected up, it had started from it had started from I think, therefore I am, and got as far as the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off. It was the size of a small city. Its main console was installed in a specially designed executive office, mounted on an enormous executive desk of finest ultra-mahogany, topped with rich ultra-red leather. The dark carpeting was discreetly sumptuous. Exotic pot plants and tastefully engraved prints of the principal computer programmers and their families were deployed liberally about the room, and stately windows looked out upon a tree-lined public square. On the day of the great turning, on the day of the great on-turning, two soberly dressed programmers with briefcases arrived and were shown discreetly into the office. They were aware that this day they would represent their entire race in its greatest moment, but they conducted themselves calmly and quietly as they seated themselves deferentially before the desk, opened their briefcases, and took out their leather-bound notebooks. Their names were Lunquill and Fook. And that's where I'm going to stop. So I hope you enjoy that. All none of you. I've just been chuntering away to myself. Still, I've had fun. Don't care if anybody else has. Of course I do. I really hope that we'd have had a few people listening in. Sorry about covering the camera up, but you know, it's an audio book. I don't see the point in watching me speak. That's absolutely pointless. And I'm not one of these people who really want to do live streams. This is all in aid of mine, which is a fabulous mental health charity who help thousands of people with mental health problems. And they really, really, really deserve any money you can spare. So please, please, please go copy and paste the link. Go to the Just Giving page and donate something. It doesn't matter how much. It really doesn't. Just donate something. Leave your name and I'll give you a shout out in the next episode, because that's what I was supposed to be doing anyway. So, you know, big shout out to David Hughes. He probably isn't listening today. He donated. I don't know any of the others. My missus, she donated, so big shout out to her. The other donators did it anonymously, so I don't know who they are. So thank you to them anyway. Huge thank you. Your money will make a huge difference. Just go out and be magnificent to each other. Just treat each other with kindness and courtesy, and just look after yourselves. Take care, and hopefully I will speak to you next week. Bye-bye.